talk now about parliamentary procedure. I for a long time, this course has been on my mind, and originally the course that I had envisioned was a revision of the PACE and developing it into a series of PACEs, but instead, it worked out like this. But from the very beginning, I always envisioned that part of the course would include a section on parliamentary procedure. And I explained it several years ago to my pastor that if you have to take this class in order to get ordained, and you have to be ordained in order to pastor a church and conduct a business meeting in the local church, then shouldn't you have to learn a little something about parliamentary procedure in order to be ordained? And so that's the purpose of this particular session tonight. Let's talk about the purpose and principles of parliamentary procedure, and just look at the how and why of rules of order. Okay, first of all, why have parliamentary procedure? Why fool with such a... First of all, let me say this. Parliamentary procedure was developed in Parliament, as its name suggests, in the British Houses of Parliament, as a matter of conducting business and conducting it in order. And of course, our government, our Congress, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate appropriated a lot of that protocol in U.S. forms of government as well. But what's the purpose of parliamentary procedure? First of all, first purpose is to establish and maintain order in a meeting. So, it's about doing things right and doing them the right way, doing the right things and doing them the right way. Establishing and maintaining order in a meeting. Otherwise, if you didn't have a process, a procedure, you just have total chaos. And so parliamentary procedure helps to establish that order. And the second thing I just said, you'd have chaos. It's to prevent confusion in the transaction of business, so that we're able to get done what we need to get done and minimize the confusion. Now, I know sometimes in church business and church government assembly business, at the General Assembly, I know sometimes you can't prevent all confusion. But some of it is just because parliamentary procedure, it only exists in the business world. And so many people are not familiar with it. And, the only time they've ever seen it is in the church business. And so that's the reason why sometimes you still end up with some confusion nonetheless. A third purpose is to keep the meeting moving, so that when you introduce a matter of business, you deal with the business, and then you move on. And so it helps us to keep the flow of the meeting, so that we're not... Have you ever been to a meeting where you didn't get anything at all accomplished, and you just talked in circles, and you just all over the place? Never done that. Well, parliamentary procedure helps keep the meeting moving. A fourth thing is it provides a voice for all opinions. One of the purposes of parliamentary procedure is so that every opinion has the opportunity to be presented and to be heard. So nobody can leave the meeting and say, well, I didn't have a voice, I didn't get a say, or leave there with something on their mind. It gives that opportunity for every opinion to be heard. And then the fifth principle, which may be the most significant, is to ensure that the minority is heard and respected while carrying out the will of the majority. And so if I ask you what was the most important principle of parliamentary procedure, and you said majority rules. Well, that's only part of it. But majority rule is an important part of parliamentary procedure, but it may not even be the most important part. It's to ensure that the will of the majority is carried out, but that the rights of the minority are not trampled on in the process, so that you're still allowing the minority to be heard and respected while carrying out the will of the majority. Let's talk about some principles of parliamentary procedure. The first one is that you're always discussing one subject at a time, so that there's never multiple things on the floor. At any given time, you're only discussing one subject. We're going to talk in just a minute about how sometimes a motion is made, and then that motion might be amended. And when there's an amendment offered, it's the amendment that is on the floor. So you're still only discussing one thing at a time. An amendment can be amended. And so if you're amending an amendment, you're still only talking about that amendment to the amendment. So that there's only one subject on the floor at any given time. And that's what we're discussing. Sometimes the moderator, and we talked in our last session about parliamentary procedure when it comes to our own meetings. And one of the principles is the speaker shall strictly adhere to the subject that is on the floor. And if he digresses, the moderator's job is to call his attention to, that's what we're discussing at this time. Again, we're helping to keep the meeting moving, helping keep it flowing, discussing one subject at a time. Second principle, it allows for the full and free discussion of an idea, so that everybody is given the opportunity to discuss freely and discuss fully the idea that is at hand. We'll talk about how valuable the principle is of free discussion and full discussion. In our Senate, the Senate has no law or has no rule against a filibuster. And if you're familiar at all with a filibuster, the speaker can get up and talk about anything. They're not required to talk about the subject that's on the hand either. They get up and talk about anything they want to talk about. And the idea is we'll take so much time talking about so many different things that eventually the opposition will get tired of it and let us move on, and we'll never actually call for a vote. And so some of the historic filibusters in our Senate have went on for days, and Senate be convened for 24 hours a day basically, where one senator's up reading whatever it is. They tell me one time a guy read out a phone book. You're just going on and on and on, and preventing the free discussion and the full discussion of the subject that's at hand. And that's a valuable principle that is protected, intended to be protected by parliamentary procedure. And it takes a 2/3 vote, to stop a filibuster, to call for a vote. And so we'll talk more about that a little later on. A third principle is to treat all members fairly and courteously, so that every member is entitled to the same privileges of speech as any other member. And so they all ought to be treated fairly and courteously. Fourth thing, carried back to our previous slide, to carry out the rule of the majority and respect the rights of the minority. And then lastly, to bring together the wishes of all the group. It's bringing together all the group members and their wishes to form a cooperating, united association. Let's talk about the introduction of business. Introducing and disposing of motions. We'll start by talking about making a motion. Anything the organization does is accomplished by introducing it to the association by a motion. So every matter of business, everything that's voted upon, every decision that is made, it commences with a motion. It's introduced through the form of a motion. And so let's talk about the process by which a motion is made. The first step is that the member who wishes to introduce the business, he addresses the chair. Many times he stands and gets the attention, he gets the recognition of the chair. When the floor is open for business, Mr. Moderator or Brother Moderator, and the chair then, once recognized, the chair recognizes the minister, gives him the floor, the member. He, once recognized, the member states the motion. He puts forth the motion, and the standard way to make a motion is, Mr. Chairman, I move that. Sometimes men will say, I make a motion, and while it's permissible, the correct way is to say, I move, or I so move that, and then state the matter of business. Once the motion has been stated, another member seconds the motion. The purpose of the second is that there's somebody else there who indicates that I feel that the motion warrants a discussion. If a motion is not seconded, it dies without a second, and there's no discussion on it. So if there's two people who feel like this is something that's worth talking about, then the floor will be open for discussion. So one member makes a motion, and a second member seconds the motion. Once seconded, the chair repeats the motion. Now, if it's a long, drawn out, complicated motion, he may ask for the member that made it to help him articulate it. It can be, until the chair states it, it can be, worded, it can be, modified. The mover and the seconder have that option of being able to modify it somewhat. And the chair states the question, and once the chair has stated the motion, then the chair asks for discussion. Now, it's typically, it is the polite thing to do that the one who makes the motion would be entitled to the floor first, to first discuss the move. That would be the typical protocol. We do sometimes, when we're talking about resolutions, whoever submitted the resolution oftentimes is the one that's given the floor first for the opportunity to discuss it. And so the chair then serves as to moderate the discussion. A lot of times in formal settings in Congress, a lot of times the floor is rotated between those who are for the motion and those who are against the motion, so that there's some discussion that takes place where someone who's for the motion speaks for it, someone who's against it comes and talks about it, and vice versa. And so the chair should moderate that to allow for a full and free discussion of the motion. After a full and free discussion, the chair then asks for the question. The chair will say something like, "Are you ready for the question?" Or in other words, "Are you all ready to vote?" If there's no further discussion, then we'll call for a vote. And so once he's asked for the question, the vote is taken between the ayes and the nays. The chair then takes the vote. As many as are in favor of the motion. Well, let me say this. Once the discussion is complete, the chair would typically state the motion one more time, and he would say, as many as are in favor of the motion to what have you, please say aye. And those would say aye, and then the chair would ask those who are opposed to the motion may say nay. And then the last thing is, after the voting, the chair declares the motion passed or defeated. So if more say aye than say no or nay, then the chair would declare the motion passed. If more say nay than say aye, then the chair would declare the motion has been defeated. Let me stop just a minute and just, what happens if you can't really tell? In Congress sometimes, Speaker of the House, it's not uncommon to hear the Speaker say, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And, especially if if it's his party that made the motion and it doesn't matter it doesn't matter what the vote really was. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And then someone usually will call for a division of the House. In our Congress, most of the time it's done with a roll call vote because each member then is requested and called by name, and you as a constituent have the right to know how your congressman voted upon a certain measure, and so then they would go through the formal counting of the votes more so than with an order. In our assembly, if there's some question, the moderator may ask for a standing vote or in some cases a secret ballot. Let's talk about disposing with a motion. Once somebody has made a motion, there's a motion on the floor, it's been seconded, now the floor is open for discussion. What do you do with it? Well, it's on the floor until it's disposed of. And so let's talk about the ways in which a motion can be disposed. First of all, by vote. The most common way to dispose of a motion is by voting on it. Whether the motion is adopted or whether it's defeated, the business moves on. So once a move has been voted on, it's disposed of. We're ready to move on to the next item on the agenda. We're ready to move forward. And so voting is by far the most common method of disposing with a motion. Go back through our minute book, and count the number of motions made, and you'll see that the vast majority of motions that are made are disposed of by voting. A second method that sometimes is used. Now, prior to being restated by the chair, the motion can be withdrawn by the maker. And the second also has to be withdrawn. So before the chair states the motion and opens the floor for discussion, the maker of the motion has the prerogative of withdrawing it, and the second being withdrawn, and then moving forward. If once the chairman has stated the motion and introduced it for discussion, the maker can still withdraw it, but he needs permission from the House to do it. And so, and again, generally speaking, if a man says, after thinking about this or after hearing talked about it, I'd like to withdraw my motion, generally speaking, the House gives him permission to do that with general consent, and they don't even have to take a vote on it. On some occasions, maybe there's some people there that just know we're going to vote this thing through, and he may have to actually take a vote on whether or not he's allowed to withdraw it. And so you're not voting on the motion itself yet, you're just voting on whether or not the motion is still on the floor. And so so unanimous consent doesn't require a formal motion to withdraw. If nobody objects, says, just let the guy withdraw it, then he's allowed to. Another method of disposing of a motion is the motion to postpone. Now, a motion may be postponed indefinitely or definitely. All right? If you move to postpone indefinitely, you're avoiding taking a direct vote on a motion. You're saying, we're not going to vote on this motion, let's put this off until sometime in the further or until never. To postpone indefinitely means we're done talking about this, let's do away with it and move on with it. You're not voting on the motion itself, and you're avoiding any further discussion on the motion. To postpone definitely means we're going to postpone this until a particular time. So the motion is, I've moved to postpone until after we come back from lunch, or until tomorrow morning. I move to postpone until 3 o'clock, or whatever the case is. There's a definite time. So at that time, whatever business might be on the floor at that particular, when that is done, then the next order of business would be the postponed motion would come back to the floor. And so, it may be that there's times where you can tell during the discussion of a motion that perhaps really in order to make this thing pass, we need to work some things out. We need to amend it in some way or another. There's something else that needs done. Say, for example, I move to postpone until after the lunch recess. During lunchtime, or I move to postpone until in the morning. Sometime somebody can sit down and work out some details that'll help move the motion to where it can be disposed of in a better way.
Who can call for the postponement? The maker?
Anybody can make a move to postpone. To postpone indefinitely or to postpone definitely. Anybody can make that move. I move to postpone. And again, the move to postpone indefinitely generally is a signal that the motion is dead. We're not going to vote on it. We're not going to kill it outright to defeat the motion. But we're not going to talk about this now, and we're probably not going to talk about this ever. But the move to postpone definitely generally means we're going to talk about this at another time when we can work out. And the idea is we can talk about this for another hour. And it might take us another hour to work out all the details, but it's a whole lot easier to work this out in a committee or in a handful of people getting together. That would move us along much faster than work on this as a committee on the whole, all trying to talk about it at the same time. So that's the move to postpone a motion. A fourth motion, or a fourth way that it can be disposed is by committing a motion. The move to commit or the move to refer is the idea. It is to commit this, to refer this to a committee. And the committee will discuss the motion in detail and come back with a recommendation. Okay? So we'll commit this to a committee, let them discuss it, let them, maybe something on the floor as it's being discussed, there's a loophole, there's just something that ain't quite, that again, working out on the floor, we're not going to be able to come to a satisfaction. There's still some valid points in this, and we just work some bugs out of it or what have you, and to commit, and then the committee would later on bring back their report and vote on it. And typically, the move to commit, puts it in the hands of the committee, and in whatever special assignment you might give them with it. And sometimes it's committed with instructions. So the instruction: take this, work it out. We want you to do this, this, and this, and bring back. The way our business is conducted. Now, you could, if we're there in business, multiple sessions, multiple days during the session. We're going to come back tomorrow. You could commit something to a committee. They could bring it back with a report tomorrow. In some of our early assemblies, there were some committees that did exactly that. They came back with a report. Our business tends to be one day, and so now you almost have to commit with instructions to designate a committee to work, and then they'll bring it back. They'll bring it back next year with a recommendation, and resubmit it, what have you, as opposed to now. If you committed something now, maybe our business this coming year is going to be election year. There may be a lot of stuff. It may require a second day's business. If you referred something to a committee in the morning or what have you, and then had them report the second day, it's possible they could come back the second day and bring a report, and the motion that was made in that, to begin with, that first motion, and any amendments that were added to it were all sent to the committee, and it all comes back, with their recommendation. They would bring the report and maybe recommend that it be amended this particular way, Sometimes you refer something to a committee for them to do some research, to find, to answer some questions, especially if you're dealing with something financially. We need to know what kind of numbers we're talking about, and so the committee would bring back a report, and then you could decide what to do with the motion based on financial data that you had. Another way of disposing of a motion is to table it, to lay on the motion to lay on the table. Now, the purpose of the motion to lay on the table is to temporarily set aside what you're talking about in order to deal with something of a more urgent nature that needed to be done right then. So we're going to stop dealing with this subject because there's some pressing matter that requires us to talk about it right now and not what we're talking about. Okay? So it's altogether different than the motion to postpone. Again, its purpose comes from the need, the need to, we need to deal with, there's some other matter that's being brought to our attention, and generally the move to table would be accompanied with that reason. Mr. Chairman, in order to more adequately deal with this pressing matter of business that's at hand, I move to table, this particular subject until, to put it on the table, and so we can deal with this thing that's more pressing, and then we'll come back, to it. And so you lay it on the table, and then at some point later, a motion is made to bring from the table. And so the motion, as it was made in any way that might have been amended, everything that's attached to it is even a motion to commit, to refer it to, if you've not voted, actually refer it to the committee yet, if somebody made a motion. Any motions that were attached to it are put on the table, and then when you make a motion to bring it from the table, it comes right back off just like it was placed on. If it's not brought off the table when the session closes, then it dies on the table. Same thing with anything that's been postponed indefinitely. If it's not dealt with, it dies when the business session closes. Now in Congress, the session lasts, for months. And so, something can be brought off the table that was tabled a month ago, whatever. Our assembly, we only have one meeting a year. And so anything that's on the table when we have that final adjournment, get through all the agenda and the final adjournment, anything that's on the table is dead when it, because we clean the table every night, or at the end of the business. And so, it couldn't be brought back up the following year, after a session. If it's tabled one day, we have business following. If it's tabled in the morning, we come back after lunch, or tabled, Tuesday, we have a meeting again on Wednesday, it can be brought back from the table. And then the other way of disposing with a motion is to amend it. And I used the phrase disposing in this example rather lightly. Basically, an amendment to a motion to amend is to change the wording of a motion. And so, you'd rise, get the attention of the chair. The chairman recognizes you by name, and you just simply say, "I move to amend the motion by," and then either adding words, striking out words, adding or subtracting, or substituting a word or sentence. So I move to amend the motion by adding this phrase at the end, or by deleting the second sentence, or by substituting the words such and such for the words such and such. And so once the motion is amended, once the motion to amend is made, it must be seconded, and then the president or the chairman calls for discussion on the amendment by restating the amended motion. Is there any discussion on the proposed amendment? And so that's fully discussed. And then when the amendment is discussed, then the chairman calls for a vote on the amendment. And the amendment either passes or fails. If the amendment fails, then the main motion stays on the floor just like it was prior to. If the amendment changes, the main motion now becomes the way it was just amended. And so further discussion would continue on the main motion, now amended, or in its original form, if the amendment failed. And so you can amend, you can have another motion to amend at that point once it becomes the main motion. It is also permissible that an amendment can also be amended. But an amendment to an amendment cannot be amended. Got that? All right? So just to keep things, again, the purpose of parliamentary procedure is to keep confusion to a minimum. And so you can't amend an amendment to amend. Let's talk about voting methods. Mentioned very briefly earlier. Most common method for voting on a motion is, again, the chair asks for those in favor to say aye, those who are opposed to say nay. The chair generally concludes from the voices whether the vote passed or failed. It might be appropriate in some cases for the chairman to ask for a hand count. Now, especially if you're in a small group, like if we were having a business meeting here tonight with the number that we've got, it might be easier to say all in favor, just raise your hand. Any opposed, raise your right hand. It might be easier to do that. You can just count the hands and then move forward. Sometimes the chair will ask for members to rise. Now, usually this is done to verify a voice vote. For example, it says all in favor say aye, aye. Any opposed say nay, nay. And there's no way to distinguish how many said what. And so he would ask then for the members, to stand. All of those that are in favor of the motion, please stand. They stand and are counted. They sit down. And then all that are opposed, would you stand? And they are counted and sit down. A lot of times a rising vote is a standing vote is oftentimes used when a motion requires a two-thirds majority. So the move to table requires a two-thirds majority. A motion to amend the bylaws, our bylaws require a two-thirds majority to amend them. So sometimes you'd ask for somebody to stand. Suspension of rules requires two-thirds. So you might ask the members to stand in order to adequately count the votes. And then a last method, most often used for elections in particular, is by ballot. Slips of paper are distributed. Choice is written and collected by those asked to tally the ballots. Generally, they're used for elections, or sometimes when the vote is upon a sensitive issue, where a ballot vote might be requested. And the idea is no member should ever be put in a position to vote publicly for a matter where his conscience is the issue. He's voting his conscience, and be asked to expose his vote. No member should ever, for example, be asked to stand to signify a particular candidate or nominee that he's voting for. It should be a closed matter, voting by secret ballot. Now let me say, in matters of all votes require a majority vote, or all votes require a two-thirds majority vote, whichever the case is. I want to say that only votes that are cast are counted. So that and by cast I mean that are an abstention doesn't count one way or another. So if you have a standing vote and more people stand for the ayes than stand for the nays, then the ayes have it. There's no, you don't count abstentions are ignored. Same thing is true when a vote is by ballot. If you have an election for an officer and candidate 1 gets 50 votes and candidate 2 gets 40 votes, candidate 1 is elected. And it doesn't matter how many people didn't cast a vote, or it doesn't matter how many people threw a blank in or what have you. The majority is counted from the votes that are actually cast. And same thing is true with the 2/3 majority vote. When you need 2/3, basically, if the yeses are twice as many as the noes, then the move passes. So again, abstentions, blanks are ignored, and the voting then is done by those that actually count votes. We were discussing on the way here a particular vote that passed in an elders meeting, 12 elders present, and the vote was 2-0, and the vote passed. Because 2 is more than 0, and so it passed. You can't compel somebody to vote. You know what I mean? And so those who refuse to vote, shouldn't be able to stop the progress of shouldn't be able to control, the handful that abstain shouldn't be able to control the meeting. And so the privilege of voting, if you choose to, not to vote, then you just chose to sit here and watch, and that's your prerogative too. But again, in the vote count and in the elections, and that's why there's some conversation about our election procedure, and I mentioned the voting in for voting for the general officials. There is no provision in our bylaws for suspending the rules to vote by acclamation when only one man is nominated for a job. Our bylaws specify that there will be a vote by ballot, and that if he's not elected on the first ballot, they call for a ballot vote. There's no provision given for suspending the rules when only one man is nominated. There has to be a ballot vote. Has to be. Now, the other thing is, nobody said that everybody has to vote. And so if guys are worried about time, and well, if we take up a vote, counting 100 votes, it's going to take all day long. If the guy gets 10 votes, if there's 10 yeses and no nos, or 10-2, or whatever the case is, he's still elected. And so, again, there's no requirement that everybody be forced to vote. And so, if a guy just says, well, you know what, it'll save a few extra seconds if you don't count my votes, I'm not going to. Or if 10 guys say, you know what, he's going to get it. What difference does it make? And chooses not to vote, then that can help move the voting along. But you cannot under any circumstances force somebody to deny them their opportunity to vote their conscience, no matter what, even in the interest of time. So, any more questions on voting?
You can vote no in that situation, correct?
Yeah. If it's a yes and no vote, the only vote that's not, you can vote yes or you can vote no. If it's a secret ballot, one candidate, yes and no, you can vote yes or no, but you cannot vote for anybody else. If there's only one person who's being considered and the vote called for is a secret ballot vote,
no write-ins.
There's no write-ins. Now, if there's 5 or 6 guys running, you can vote for anybody anybody that's a member, anybody that's qualified, that vote would count. There's no requirement for somebody to be nominated in order to be elected. There's no requirement for that. So, now the chances of getting elected, if you've not been nominated, are really slim, because nobody is assured publicly that you're willing to take the job if you're elected. But you can write in a vote. If it's a legal vote, it's a member that would otherwise be qualified, then you can write that vote in. If it's not a secret, a yes and no vote. So let's talk about types of motions and their order of precedence. Five kinds of motions. And I'm listing these in reverse order of their precedence. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. First of all, unclassified motions. These motions enable certain items to be reconsidered. In general, they're brought up when no business is pending. And so there might be, for example, the motion to take from the table is an unclassified motion. Generally done, there's nothing else on the floor, and we're at a point in the business where we're ready for the next order, nothing on the agenda, and so you could make a motion to take from the table. Sometimes the motion to reconsider. If there's a move that was made and voted upon, and and then later in the business, somebody decides, you know what? I think we voted the wrong way. I'd like to make a move that we reconsider the issue and bring back what we just voted. So, for example, if you make a motion and you voted the motion down, say the motion was defeated, someone could make a motion to reconsider the move and to bring it back up for consideration. Now, let me say this: move to reconsider can only be made by somebody who voted in the opposite. So you can only make a motion to reconsider a move if you voted the other way, if you've changed your mind on the issue. And so it's not used very much because of that. But and then the other unclassified move is the move to rescind. So, for example, if you voted to do something, and then later on decide, you know what, we need to undo that. The move to rescind, to go back and to undo the actions that were or to undo the move that was made. These are unclassified motions. Then there's main motions, and the main motions, just what they sound like, motions that bring business to the group, that allow formal discussion of an item being brought before the group. They're general motions. A third type is subsidiary motions. And these motions assist the group in treating or disposing of a main motion. These are the kinds of motions that I just talked about in that last slide. These are motions that directly apply to the motion that's on the floor. So the motions that can hasten action upon, delay action upon, or modify the main motion. The move to lay on the table, the move to commit, or the move to amend. There's also another subsidiary motion that sometimes gets misused, is the motion to call for the previous question. And the motion to call for the previous question means I move that we stop debating and go straight to the vote. And so the move for the previous question requires a second and requires a 2/3 majority vote. So the idea is that if you're going to stop talking about something and go straight to the vote, where nobody else is allowed to talk on this issue, that should only be done when 2/3 of the members are in favor of it. So anything that would be used to suppress the discussion of a motion should require 2/3 majority vote. So the move to call for the previous question requires a second and a 2/3 majority vote. Again, I move that we stop talking about it and let's vote on it. Then there's incidental motions. These motions deal with questions of procedure. They arise out of another pending motion or an item of business. Usually they're points of order. They're not debatable. Usually they're points of order. A move to appeal the decision of the chair. Sometimes the move to close or reopen nominations would be an incidental motion. And the move to suspend the rules would be an incidental motion. And again, suspension of rules, you can only suspend the rules if the rules provide for a method of their suspension. So to suspend our bylaws, you can only do it if the bylaws specify the circumstances under which they can be suspended. And then the last type, and the most important, again, these are in reverse order of their precedence. Most important, privilege motions, they do not relate to the pending question. But they're matters of such urgency or importance that without debate, they'll interrupt the consideration of anything else. And so these are moves to call for the orders of the day or a motion to adjourn. You hear somebody say sometimes, motion to adjourn is always in order. It's a privilege motion. We've abused the motion to close the nominations. I know we've abused that. We had a general officer in the past who, when it was time to open the floor for nominations, he would ask all of those who have a nomination, please stand. and then they would stand, and he'd start in the back, like, Parliamentary Procedure calls for, start at the back and move his way forward, let each man make his nomination. When everybody who was standing is now seated, then he'd say, if there are no other nominations, I'll entertain a motion to close the nomination. The chair should never entertain a motion to close the nominations when there are other. First of all, the man doesn't have the floor. You're not been recognized or what have you by the chair. If there are men that are still standing, to make nominations, the chair shouldn't recognize that move at all. Now, of course, the redress that you have against that is if he does, there is a move in a second, then, obviously, you could call for a point of order and say, brother, I was standing to be recognized to make a nomination, and the brother who made the move should, out of courtesy, be willing to withdraw it or hold off on it or what have you until you were able to make your nomination or until all the nominations were made. You can vote no to the closing of the nominations. You have that privilege. To ask for the floor to be reopened for nominations would take a little bit more maneuvering, and the challenge there is if you didn't challenge the closing of the nominations, you shouldn't ask for a reopening. Now, it is of course there have been occasions where we've closed the nominations and then realized we had more people decline. We had a committee of 5, only had 4 nominated. We've done voted to close. So then you have to have a motion to reopen the floor for nominations under those circumstances. So I think we probably need to do a better job, from our organization standpoint, of giving every person who has that, again, the easiest way to do it, everybody who has a nomination, please stand. And then just call on, if you don't have a nomination that's burning on your heart, whatever, and you're willing to stand when everybody else stands, wait to see who else is nominated or whatever. It's not a valid reason to formulate a nomination. Everybody ought to stand together, and then it should just be a matter of principle that everybody who's asked to stand is given their nomination, and now we're ready for a move to close. It's a formality to close the nominations. Talk about elections real quickly. Nominations are generally made from the floor by members. And though it's a form of a motion, it's not. They need not be seconded. Generally, a motion and second are required to close the nominations. Vote. Election takes place by ballot. Like we said earlier, if one candidate is nominated, a yes/no vote is taken. A candidate must receive a majority of all eligible votes cast in order to be elected. Nomination is just a formality. It is not a requirement for election. However, the likelihood of an election by candidate not placed in nomination is marginally slim. If you just had a big writing campaign, just wrote it, and managed to get a majority, then I'd really be interested in seeing how you managed to do that. A rule requiring officers to be elected by ballot cannot be suspended by a unanimous vote, because the rule protects a minority of one from exposing his vote. And this he must do if he votes openly in the negative or objects to giving general consent. Nor can this result be accomplished by voting that the ballot of the assembly be cast by the secretary or anyone else, as this does away with the essential principle of the ballot, namely secrecy. And so, I'm reading directly from Robert's Rules of Order. If it is desired to allow the suspension of a bylaw that cannot be suspended under these rules, then it is necessary to provide in the bylaws for its suspension. And so, there would have to be a formal change to that process. The last area that I'm going to look at is business meetings in local church. I want to throw some guiding principles on conducting of local church business. It is true that in some ways the business of the General Assembly is not as complicated or as sophisticated as the business is done by Congress or Parliament. And so sometimes I know that we don't always do things in order, parliamentary procedure. I know that in the Assembly's business, sometimes we just do things and, because the formality isn't as necessary as maybe it would be in Congress or somewhere. In the local church, that's even more so. And so I want to just talk about some principles of local church business. I'm pulling some principles out of an article from Ministry Magazine in October 1948. And so, 70-year-old, I found this article online, and I thought it still had some very valid. Stuff. A church business meeting differs from the typical parliamentary session of a secular group in which Robert's Rules of Orders sets the pattern of procedure. And so consequently, the usual order will be modified. Though many of the basic principles of parliamentary law are valid, it will be profitable to note the differences in a principle as a basis for the differences in procedure. Okay? So, in the first place, the church is not democratic. All right? So understand the difference. The church is not democratic. It is not governed on the basis of majority rule with protection for the minority. Rather, it is highly selective in its membership and strictly intolerant of minorities. As a consequence, its voice is unanimous on all important issues and tends to be unanimous on small issues. Okay? There is a commendable reluctance to proceed with the new roof for the church building as long as there is a distinct opposition. Church voted to do it, but there's still a handful of people in the church that are really adamantly opposed to doing it. You could say, majority rules, bless God. This is what the majority voted to do, and you can cause more harm to the local church by doing what the majority ruled to do than by not doing it. Even such minor items as the repair of the furnace are part of the Lord's work. And as far as possible, the church should be united in its program on these small matters. Let me say, the first item on the agenda is unity. Don't underestimate the power of church business to bring division and strife and disharmony into the local church body. The first item is unity. What can we do to ensure that the church is united, to bring us in? Now, I'm not talking about empowering a local church boss that has to make every decision. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about championing the principles of unity. I'm talking about giving voice to we only do what so and so says to do, this and that and the other. But doing all we can to protect and guard the unity of the church. Now, because there's no place for a minority faction, the completely open session really is never sanctioned. That the business to come before the whole body should be carefully prepared in advance by a small group in order to do that. Do as little business as possible in the meeting itself. So, talked about in the General Assembly business, you might have an issue that's on the floor, and then there's all kinds of talk and all kinds of discussion, about it, and you realize right away, we're not going to get this thing done with 112 delegates trying to all talk about this and whatever. The best thing to do is a smaller group, work out a plan and bring it. And we talked about the resolution committee in the last session. The resolution committee's job is to take those new resolutions and to compare them to existing resolutions, to discuss needed changes with the presenter. The best thing the resolution committee can do is to talk with the submitter and say, listen, this is not going to work, the best thing you can do is let's make some modifications and to present resolutions that have the best chance of being adopted. To work all that, to talk about all those things, pros and cons, to work it all out before it ever hits the delegation floor. And the same thing is true in the local church, maybe even on a larger basis. That instead of discussing in the local church business, things that you don't have all the answers to yet. You talk about, well, it's hard to take a motion to buy a piece of property, for example, if you don't know yet how much you can get it for. So it might be appropriate to allow the trustees to negotiate with the owner of the property and to make an offer or whatever contingent upon approval from the whole church. It's a whole lot easier to get that done first than to have a meeting, talk about it, and with the whole body, be 14 different directions, come to, and then go back to the owner, and him not even want to fool with you. So do as little business as possible in the meeting itself. And so, because of that, the opening of the floor for business, which any member may propose, is not. I'm going to tell you something. There's nothing scarier than what happens after that moment when a pastor says, "Is there any new business?" There's just nothing. There's being blindsided by by whatever might come up or whatever, and so deal with as much. And there's so many things. Do as little business as possible in the meeting itself. You go back through some old church minutes from different congregations, whatever, through the years. It's amazing the kinds of things that were discussed and voted upon in church business meetings. I heard about one pastor said they talked for 45 minutes in the church, a business meeting, about whether or not to buy a new vacuum cleaner. Really? I mean, if the church doesn't need a new vacuum cleaner, then don't buy it. If the church needs a new vacuum cleaner, then buy it. There's some things that you can deal with, prior to the meeting, and it's quite possible. A lot of things people want to talk about openly and what have you, that probably you can get a lot more done. And the way a lot of churches have business nowadays, if it's quarterly or semi-annual, or some churches even just have one annual business meeting. If you wait around for the annual business meeting to roll around, you may have missed all the opportunities to get done whatever it was that you needed to get done anyway. And so do as little as possible. Another issue, and let me just say too, on that last point, that problems that come up incidentally haven't escaped the attention of a preliminary hearing. They're oftentimes referred back to somebody to get more information anyway. So why not deal with it up ahead of time? Any procedure that hints of controversy, should really be dealt with a smaller group first. That you work out some things and whatever before you bring that to a matter to the whole group. Here's the fourth thing: strict adherence to parliamentary law may be counterproductive. Parliamentary procedure must be varied sometimes in line with these differences in objective. We've got a different objective in mind. Just one example. Just one example. Ordinarily, the standard way to do business is a motion and a second, restated by the chair, and then an opportunity for discussion. Most of the time in local churches, that's almost counterproductive. You're better off first by having at least some discussion, by letting the person who's presenting the motion, for example, maybe bring it up through a discussion, talking about the principles involved. It may be even in order to fully discuss the subject and then say, now that we've kind of come to some idea of what we want to do, can I have a formal motion in a second to do what we just what we just discussed. It may be that the way the motion would be made in the beginning is not at all the way the motion would end up. And so sometimes in the local church, it might be better, it might be more conducive to business to allow for a full discussion, and then the pastor moderator say, what's your pleasure? How should we deal with this, and call for a vote? Another thing that's true to that too is typically the chairman should be responsible for moderating the business and shouldn't give his decision or his opinion on a chair without without the chair being fulfilled, or what he shouldn't give his opinion on a subject or whatever. Well, can you imagine trying to do business without knowing what the pastor thinks about it? I mean, without getting some feedback from the what do you think we should do? And so again, a strict adherence to parliamentary procedure. Can you imagine a pastor strictly following the guidelines of parliamentary procedure, never sharing his opinion on a matter? After the business meeting is over, you find out the pastor was dead against 4 things that you did in that meeting. Why would you do? Or worse than that, maybe even have the pastor resign because of something that you voted to do. I don't know. I can't stay with him because of that. So again, you're better off a lot of times to discuss a subject rather than a motion. Talk about election procedure. Again, unity is the primary goal in the business of the church. And so when it comes to elections, the election of officers, for example, here again, the procedure is not wholly democratic. And of course, according to our bylaws, the nomination of the local officers is done by the pastor. And so some would say, well, that's not even, that's not democratic at all. That's almost like a dictatorship. Now, of course, he's only nominating, and it's still up to the church to vote yes or no on those nominations. But let me just say about the principle of elections. Is there any benefit in announcing the number of no votes on a particular election? Say you have an election for the clerk or what have you, is there any benefit that comes from having announced to the, if you've got tellers or trustees or your clerk, whoever's counting the votes and whatever, they come to the conclusion that, that there were more yeses than there were noes, is there any benefit from having announced, well, he got 5 no votes? Is there any? The principle again is protecting the unity of the church. We have for the last several years, since the bylaws changed now to where there's no open nominations for the officers and the pastor nominates those officers. I always put together a ballot with the position and the person who's been nominated and a place for them to circle yes or no. And so we have our vote in that manner, and then the votes are counted, and then it's announced they were all elected. So again, now the clerk might make a note in the minutes of what the actual vote count was or what have you, but for the record's sake or what. But again, it's of no value to and it may be counterproductive in actually announcing that there was opposition. And then just the last part, just respect people's time. If you get people to show up for a business meeting, we've been, since I've been pastor, we've been having business meetings on Sunday nights at the conclusion of service. I don't like it. Honestly, I don't like it at all. I've said that several times. And just in the absence of doing anything else, it's just a necessary evil. It's just the best time to do it because we're all, for the most part, members are already there. You can announce it a few weeks ahead of time or whatever, and just get it done. But you have a worship service, and there's going to be a business meeting that follows, and the only thing maybe worse than having a business meeting right after church is maybe having a business meeting right before church. That'd be the only thing I can think of. But you know, the truth is, I mean, in the old days, we'd have church business meeting, and you have it on an off night or whatever, and you know, you would have anybody show up. And so, if you have people who stick around for a business meeting, people come to a business meeting, then respect their time. You know, stick to the agenda and keep the business, you know, flowing. And I'm not talking about just, you say, well, what any point in us even being here then if all that's we just get. But at the same time, we don't have to be here all night either. To, you know, if there's a valid reason for lengthening, you know, the meeting, then do it. But respect people's time and stick to the agenda and get done what. Get done what you came to do, and thank people for taking the time to be with you. Does anybody have any questions on parliamentary procedure?